Hello. In this video I would like to talk you through a short text by Theodor Adorno, which is called Society. And it is about the concept of society. It is actually a handbook entry that Adorno wrote in, I think, 1965, so quite late in his life. So it summarizes some of the principal ideas on the concept of society in Adorno's thinking. And it's a quite useful little text because it is relatively short, but it is quite dense, so it's quite typical in that respect of the very condensed and almost sort of literary form in which, especially in his late essays, Adorno writes. So in a style that reflects in the presentation the dialectical structure of his thinking. By dialectical I mean here that the thought process is kind of, it's almost like the writing is almost like a picturing of the thought process. So the text is structured in longish paragraphs, each of which more or less develops one idea, and then the next paragraph develops a different idea. A little bit almost like in a piece of music where you have a theme and then a different theme, and then they sort of develop against each other and so on. So it's that kind of dialectical thinking. It's not so much the thing that you might know from the textbook definition of dialectics, that there's this thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing going on. There's no synthesis. That's perhaps the most interesting aspect here. So there are just different bits and pieces that are kind of constructed together in a sort of a constellation of different blocks of text, and you have basically to work out for yourself what is actually the overall meaning of that text. It's not at all clearly stated, and that is obviously part of the difficulty, but it's also part of the fun in this kind of writing, because it is a very open kind of writing. So you can work with this, and because it is at the same time a handbook entry, although a very strange kind of handbook entry. So normally a handbook entry is meant to give you a quick overview of all the important things, and this is certainly not what this text does. So overview, yes, but not quick. So it is it does contain a lot of references to other sociologists, and that is relatively unusual in Adorno, and that is also one reason why I chose this text, because you can see some of the ways in which critical theory of the Frankfurt School, of which Adorno is of course the main representative, relates to, in particular, Durkheim and Max Weber. Spencer gets mentioned, I think Marx gets mentioned probably. So you can sort of see how critical theory relates to all these traditions that you're already familiar with, so that gives you perhaps a good way to locate what this rather complicated thing called critical theory is in relation to the sociological tradition. So the first paragraph basically starts with the idea that concepts are essentially shorthand for process. So instead of process, you could also say history. So all theoretical concepts are condensed history. So they are kind of shorthand abbreviations, sort of markers for what actually are processes. And as processes, or as history, they are infinite, so they're not finite, so they're not definable. And that's why, in Adorno's view, concepts can actually not be defined, because they refer to a process which is infinite. So infinite is the opposite of finite, right? So you cannot have a proper definition which of course is a very strange way of starting a handbook entry, which almost by definition delivers definitions of things. That's what you're looking for when you go for a handbook or a dictionary. And Adorno, the first thing he says is basically that's not going to happen, so there will not be a definition. And then he explains what kind of definition it will not be. So for example, he goes through several examples of what could perhaps be thought of as a definition of the concept of society, such as society is all human beings. And that is misleading, because it would presuppose that society is itself already human, is immediately one with its subjects. So that is a very typical Adorno sort of statement. The individuals in society, so the human beings, they are human beings. But in the moment in which they form a society, they are actually not humane. Because in Adorno's view, society is not, or at least not yet, a humane constellation of human beings. And therefore these human beings are not actually properly human. That might sound a bit weird. That is partly a translation problem, because in German the words human and humane are the same word. So the pun, if you like, works much better in German. So the human society is not yet humane. That's basically the idea here. And that is sort of in a negative way already still some sort of a definition. So a society is something that is not quite yet humane. That's the first point here. And then if you look at the sentence that is underlined in green, as though the specifically social did not consist precisely in the imbalance of institutions over men. Men, of course, as usual here, means human beings. The latter, the human beings, coming little by little to be the incapacitated products of the former. So, he's basically saying in a slightly indirect manner that the specifically social, that what makes society is the imbalance of institutions over the human beings who constitute these institutions, because obviously we make the institutions, but something is happening here in this process that makes these institutions become basically the producers of us. So we are produced by the institutions, although we actually make the institutions. But it so happens, and that is the specifically social, so that which makes society actually society, it makes us into its objects. And that means, of course, society makes us not to be human beings, not to be humane, because if we were human beings, we would be the subjects, right? And the institutions would be our objects, our instruments, in our command. But the reality is that we are under the command of the institutions. That is the opening statement here, which is quite heavy stuff. So that we are basically becoming the incapacitated products of society. And that's the first definition, or the first sort of approximation of a definition that Adorno gives. And he says, so in the past, so before the modern period, things may have been different, so the word society would probably not really have applied, etc. So really, when he talks about society, he means modern society. That is sort of the opening statement here. And in particular, we're talking about advanced capitalism. So this is written in the late 20th century. So this is basically about the present period. And then there is a historical note in the last sentence here. He refers to a 19th century political theorist who was pointing out that society is a concept of the third estate. So the third estate, as you surely know, is a concept coming from medieval philosophy that refers to the producers in society. So you know the first estate is the clerics, the second estate the aristocracy, or is it the other way around? I don't know, actually, no. Anyway, aristocracy and the clerics are the two leading estates, and the third estate is basically everybody else. That means the bourgeois, the people who live in bourge, in the cities, workers, peasants, farmers, etc. So people who actually produce stuff. That is the third estate. And as you know, in the French Revolution, the most important ideological statements of the bourgeois revolution in the late 18th century was in the name of the third estate. So the people of the third estate were saying, well, we take over the leadership of society now in the place of replacing and displacing aristocracy and clerics. And that is the context in which the modern concept of society emerges. That is the historical note here in this sentence. And this distinguishes it from an older usage of the word society that we still have, in the sense, high society, or like when you say, in society you have to wear particular formal clothes or something like that. So it's the same word but has a completely different meaning, and that has a historical reason, because this more narrow use of the word society is basically from the feudal period. Okay, that was the first paragraph. Second paragraph. So it is not a classificatory concept, by which he means a concept like in biology perhaps, or in other natural sciences. You would typically have a hierarchy of concepts, where you have a very generic concept and all the others sort of come under it, like animal, mammal, and then all the individual mammals. So this is what is called a classificatory concept. This is not so, because it is not simply the most generic concept of all the sociological concepts. And that is the statement here in the second paragraph, and that has to do with the relationship between the whole, the totality of society, and the different units within it. So they are not strictly in a hierarchy. They are rather in a dynamic relationship where they mutually constitute each other. All the elements constitute each other mutually and not in a strictly hierarchical sort of manner. That is the second point. Then in the third paragraph is arguing that because of this functional structure, namely the idea that the different elements of society are defined by the function they have for each other, the notion of society cannot be grasped in any immediate fashion. So you can't touch, you can't nail down what is society, because it is basically a relationship between all the elements that make up society. So the notion of society may not be deduced from any individual facts. So you cannot simply bring together a lot of data, facts, and then deduce the concept of society from that. But there is nonetheless no social fact which is not determined by society as a whole. So the totality, the whole of society, determines the shape of every single element. Society appears as a whole behind each concrete social situation. So if you think of other institutions, for example the family, as an element that makes up society, then it is not only that society is somehow a lower level category, but it is also so that society is shaped by these elements, but at the same time these elements are shaped by society. So family as an institution is of course much older than modern society. But the specific type of society that we have within modern society is a product of modern society. So modern society as a whole is shaping what the elements individually all look like. So that is meant by this dynamic relationship that is mutually constitutive. So society appears as a whole behind each concrete social situation. Then he gives as an example conflicts, for example, a conflict in a labor situation, and he says that the way people act in that conflict is determined by the overall structure of society. So you cannot simply, and that is an important methodological point actually, when you go to do empirical research, you cannot simply bracket out everything else and just focus in on one small thing. You will probably misunderstand that thing because the shape of that thing is determined by society as a whole. So you need to have an approach that looks at the totality of society in every little detail. Which also means, on the other hand, that every little detail can illuminate the whole of society. That's quite handy. So you can basically, if you have a concept of society, you can look at every little bit that is that can be found within society, and you can use it to unlock basically the concept of society. So it works both ways. That is part of the thinking here. So all these, he says, all these individual conflicts are symptoms of deeper antagonisms, and these antagonisms are basically the dynamics of society itself that constitute certain laws according to which such conflicts are located in time and space. So if you have a specific conflict, like a conflict, say, in a particular place of labor, in a particular institution, then how, when, and where this conflict takes place and how it plays out is determined by the overall dynamics of society. So this goes on a little bit further, so I'm kind of jumping over some things here. So the last sentence on this page here: just as social mediation cannot exist without that which is being mediated, without its elements, individual human beings, institutions, situations. In the same way, the latter cannot exist without the former's mediation. So this is one of the central concepts in Adorno's sociology: mediation. Mediation means one thing becomes the medium of another thing. So one thing is expressed in the form of something else. So the individual human beings are mediated through society. So society is the form in which these individual human beings actually exist. So we exist as society. And at the same time, society is mediated through the individual human beings, because society doesn't exist except in the form of individuals. But these individuals, us, are mediated forms of society. So it's a mutually, that's what I mean when I say it's mutually constitutive. Individuals don't actually exist unless in society, because the concept of individual is a product of society. Society doesn't exist unless in the flesh of individuals, because society is a concept that is mediated through individuals and the relationships that they have, the situations, institutions, and so on. So that is the third paragraph. Paragraph 4 is simply making a case that because this is so, because society is not, you cannot grasp society immediately in some form, only through theoretical work you can understand what society is. So society, because it is such a relatively abstract concept, is only accessible for us through theory. And that's basically why we have theory modules, because the concept of society as such is not available in any other form. So we can only see society in the individual objects that we look at, or individual human beings, if we have the theory that allows us to see it. So we have to know already that individuals and society are mediating each other. And then, when we know that through theoretical reflection, then we can also see it. That's the idea here. Now the fifth paragraph has sort of some of the central thrust of this article. The requirement that society must be defined through theory must further address itself to the suspicion that such theory lags far behind the model of the natural sciences, still tacitly assumed to be binding on it. In the natural sciences, theory represents a clear point of contact between well-defined concepts and repeatable experiments. A theory society, however, is self-developing, so the theory develops itself through its own dynamic, through reflection on other theories, that is. However, such a theory need not concern itself with this intimidating model from the natural sciences, given its enigmatic claim to mediation. For the objection measures the concept of society against the criterion of immediacy and presence. So in the natural sciences, the objects that are established are actually present, whereas society is just mediation. So it is a relational concept. It is not actually an object that is present, so it can't be grasped. Therefore, the criteria of the natural sciences have no validity for society. So the science of society works in a completely different way. The next step is the ideal of knowledge of things from the inside. So this is one of the approaches in classical sociology. It is claimed that the theory of society entrenches itself behind such subjectivity. So that is an accusation that comes from critics of modern sociology. That is all subjective, because we are kind of intuitively feel ourselves into the object, and then we discover this mysterious thing, society. And these critics say that this only hinders progress and so on. This is, however, something Adorno rejects. And this is now very interesting. Against this accusation, he says, we must point out that society is both known and not known from the inside. That is very interesting, because we are the people who do the knowing, but we are obviously inside society. So society can only be known from inside because there is no outside. No human being is outside society. So he says, inasmuch as society remains a product of human activity, its living subjects are still able to recognize themselves in it. Because we made this. So we are the producers of society, so we are able to understand what it is, right? If I make something, if I make a cake, then I understand what that is, because I've made it. I know how it's made, because I've made it. The same is true of society, to an extent. We made it, so we know it from the inside, because we are the makers. And we can actually recognize our own producing society in the product, which is society. It's still recognizable as a human product. And that is completely different from the objects of chemistry and physics, because if you analyze a rock that you found somewhere, well, you haven't made that rock. So you cannot understand what that rock is from the inside, because you are outside that rock. That rock is actually an object that is not you. Completely different from society. And then he says something very funny. It is a fact that in middle-class society, rational action is objectively just as comprehensible as it is motivated. This was the great lesson of the generation of Max Weber and Dilthey. Dilthey is Max Weber's teacher. Yet their ideal of comprehension remained one-sided, insofar as it precluded, bracketed out, everything in society that resisted identification by the observer. So, this is Adorno saying that Max Weber, with his, you remember this Verstehen, this approach of understanding, so we have to understand society and any phenomenon in society, is correct to a large extent because it is formulated by people who are very much aware that they are the makers of this society. But it is one-sided, and this is where he brings in the next sentence Durkheim. This was the sense of Durkheim's rule that one should treat social facts like objects, basically like stones. One should first and foremost renounce any effort to understand them. So that is against Max Weber. Durkheim was firmly persuaded that society meets each individual primarily as that which is alien and threatening, as constrained. So every social phenomenon, and you remember that from reading Durkheim, every social phenomenon is something outside us, because otherwise for Durkheim it would be psychology. So if it's really sociology, then it must be something that is outside us and in that sense objective. And that means we cannot understand it. And that's the great thing about Durkheim, because Durkheim admits that we cannot understand society because it is so alien. Now Adorno is arguing here basically to take together Max Weber and Durkheim because they're both half right, but they're both one-sided. So Max Weber thinks, we can understand it all because we made it. But that's too simple. And Durkheim thinks we can't understand it because it is alien. So both are right, although they're saying the exact opposite thing. And that is an aspect of dialectical thinking, which is here kind of played through by Adorno. Max Weber and Durkheim say completely different things, but they're both right. But they're also both wrong. Because society is something that we can understand to a point, but something that is alien and not understandable at the same time. That is the proposition here. Society is alien and threatening and dangerous and puts limits on us. But still it is true that we made this alien and threatening thing. So that's the basic idea here. That is the contradiction. Or as in the previous paragraph, the word used was antagonism. So you have these conflicting truths about society. And then he says some more things about Durkheim here, which we can that Durkheim is sort of related to the philosopher Hegel in this respect, so we can jump over that. So this antithesis to Max Weber remains just as partial as Max Weber's own thesis. So there is incomprehensibility, but there's also comprehensibility. Yet this resistance of society to rational comprehension should be understood first and foremost as the sign of relationships between men which have grown increasingly independent of them, of these relationships, opaque, now standing off against human beings like some different substance. That is basically Durkheim's observation, that society is this alien thing. And it is the task of sociology to understand the incomprehensible, the advance kind of being sarcastically used here, of human beings into the inhuman. So we jump over the next paragraph. There was nothing terribly new added. The 7th paragraph. He takes the notion of a role that was prevalent in contemporary sociology, obviously contemporary in the 1960s. Playing a role, which obviously is taken from the theater, it's a metaphor that sociology takes from the theater, is just another word for saying being for others. So if you're playing a role, then you're not yourself, obviously. So he says here, human beings find their roles in that structural mechanism of society which trains them to pure self-conservation at the same time that it denies them conservation of their selves. Now this is again a very strange sort of sentence. Adorno is saying here that the principal thing that we undertake in society is the struggle for self-conservation. So or self-preservation is more commonly the expression. So what we do in society is we reproduce ourselves. We produce the things that we need to preserve our lives, which is called self-preservation or self-conservation here. But at the same time, the way society organizes this process of self-preservation actually destroys these selves. And that happens through the institution of role-playing. So we are forced, in order to preserve our existence, to play roles, which means not being ourselves. So we have all these roles to play, which, if they are roles, means that there's something given from outside. There's a script. Somebody has given us the script, like in the theater, and now we have to play this role for somebody else. Because I play a role, which means function, basically. That's a function in this perspective, for another person or group of persons, maybe another class in society, or whatever you might be thinking of. And that basically denies ourselves, because when you play a role, then you are not yourself. So in order to preserve the self, we have to destroy the self. That's another one of these contradictions or antagonisms. The all-powerful principle of identity itself, the abstract interchangeability of social tasks, works toward the extinction of their personal identities. So, this is again very strange. Same thing basically. Society gives us all these identities, but the identities are basically destroying our personal identities. So the identities that society gives us are basically identifications. So we have to identify ourselves with something that we actually are not. For example, roles. We have to identify ourselves. So I have to identify myself with the role of, say, teacher, when actually maybe I'm really something totally different. Myself is not that role. That role is actually denying myself. But I'm obviously forced to accept some such role. It doesn't have to be this one. This is actually a relatively pleasant one, so there are other roles that are much less pleasant, but a role it has to be. Or an identity. So you could also think of other identities like nationality. So you are basically encouraged or more or less forced by society to have a national identity. But maybe that is not actually your personal identity. So you see here there's a very strange double play with the word identity. So an identity is at the same time something like a role. That's something you have to adopt, which is basically not yourself. But the word identity also means something that is specifically you. When I say my personal identity, I'm referring to the things that are totally unique about myself and that nobody has, nobody else, qualities that nobody else has. But when I talk about identity as in, okay, my gender identity, my national identity, etc., etc., these are things that I share with everybody else who has the same identity, right? So when I say I have a British identity, that means I have something in common with all other people who fall into the same category of British identity. Whereas when I talk about my personal identity, that means I'm referring to all the things that make me different from all other people who otherwise fall into the same identity category. That's the strange way the word identity works. It's very confusing, and I think the way this works in such a contradictory manner is very much what defines the word identity in the way it is used in our society. Okay, that is the this is roughly the argument here in this paragraph. We're coming now to paragraph A. So in here he calls this role-playing a monstrosity. It's just a horrible characteristics of societal structures. So in the 8th paragraph, next paragraph, he talks about what a concept of society would look like that would be a critical one. And he says it would go beyond the trivial idea that everything is interrelated. Now again, he's sort of polemicizing against concepts that were common and fashionable in his time, so that's the mid-60s. So it was common to emphasize that everything in society is interrelated, which is of course true, but Adorno says it is trivial. That means it's not wrong, but it doesn't say very much. And in particular, it is an uncritical concept. It is a concept that simply describes something, and the something that it describes is basically the market system. So in a market society, everything is interrelated because everything is exchangeable against everything else through the mediation of money, right? So if you sell one thing and you receive money for that, that money can then be exchanged for pretty much any other thing, which means that these two things, through the mediation of money, money being the medium in the middle, are the same. So they're equated with each other, at least in certain quantities of these two different things. So different things become essentially the same in the moment when they are equated and mediated through money. So he says basically when people say, oh, everything is interrelated, that actually they're talking about this system of exchange through equation mediated by money. And that creates this vast network of consumers, etc., etc. And he talks about this as an abstraction that is implicit in the market system, because this exchange process through the mediation of money is an abstraction. Because from the object A that I'm selling, I'm abstracting all specifically unique characteristics. They're all stripped away. That's what abstraction actually means. Abstraher means to pull off, to pull away something. So we pull away all the unique things, and we have only the essence, which is identical to the essence of the money, and then the essence of that other object that we are buying in the next step. So that's how market society works, how the mediation of money works, and that is a process of abstraction. But it is a real abstraction, an abstraction that actually happens in a societal process. And this market abstraction reduces main human beings to agents and bearers of exchange value, because we are basically reduced to being the people who carry around the money, which is the mediating agent of this entire process. So what we individually think and want and would like to produce doesn't matter, because what we produce is determined by this overall mediating relationship, which is the market society. And then he says, behind this strange abstracting process lies the domination of men over men. So behind the truth behind the market society is that one group of human beings is ruling over another. That is the argument here. So you can sort of guess. He doesn't seem to want to be very explicit here, but I imagine you can sort of guess that he means sort of Marxist concept of class society with this domination of men over men. So that is the 8th paragraph, slightly more complicated. Paragraph 9. Here he talks about areas in society that are not yet quite transformed by the money relationship and the market exchange relationship. He talks about the survival of retrograde or backward areas and archaic social forms. And it's very funny here because he discusses this at 2 levels that are completely different if you would sort of normally assume. On the one hand, he talks about so-called backward areas, but backward is again sort of sarcastic, so backward in comparison to the advanced stages of capitalist society. And such a backward area would be the family, which is basically an irrational institution, because it is based on, now sounds a little bit idealistic, but basically, if you think about it, it's in principle true. The family is based on the idea of love, or a solidarity between a group of human beings who are not exchanging equivalents. So if you do something within the family, you do not necessarily expect to receive an exactly equivalent amount of something else in the way you do in a market relationship. So within the family, unless it's a very modern family maybe, market relationships don't exist. You do things basically for the love of it. Or simply, maybe this is a bit too romantic to say this, then you could say you simply do this because of what or who you are. So you have an obligation to operate within the family because that's what you are. That is completely different from a market and exchange relationship. And he calls that basically a backward area, because this is something that has survived from pre-capitalist societies. And then he compares this basically to what in the 60s still would have been called underdeveloped countries, which we would now probably call developing countries or peripheral countries or whatever. So the third world, that is also an antiquated term from the 60s, but you know what I mean. Actually, many of those are now actually quite advanced and modern societies, but obviously this is written in the 60s, so he refers here to the developing world, if you like. And so you have in these peripheral countries, to use the word from world system analysis, in these peripheral countries you have areas within society that are actually quite modern and industrial, but then there would be large pockets of basically archaic forms of society where people do not operate through wage labor and exchange relations. Then he says that even these enclaves from pre-capitalistic social relations, they are actually functional, they are integrated as being functional for the overall world system of capitalist production. So even these enclaves of archaic social forms, they are integrated. Although they are themselves not capitalist, they have a function that makes them subordinate to the overall capitalist system. And then he says, irrational institutions such as love and the family are useful to the stubborn irrationality, that's a nice sentence, of a society which is rational in its means but not in its ends. Right, so you have to probably read that again. Our society is rational in its means, so the means, the instruments and institutions, they are all structured in a rational sort of, in a way that produces results and oriented towards performance and getting stuff done. But the ends, the goals, the meaning of that society is irrational, because basically it is simply the highest possible increase of profit and surplus value, which is totally irrational because it doesn't mean anything. So it's not. It is a very bizarre form, or kind of a misguided form of wealth that becomes the dominant goal within society. Now, to have irrational institutions such as the family, so we have an irrational institution that is subordinated to the rationality of this modern capitalist society, which in itself is totally irrational. Right? So it's a kind of strange kind of thought where rationality and irrationality are sort of intermixed with each other. So there's different layers of rationality and irrationality, and it's got a confusing mixture. And then he says, that's interesting, that the family owes its relative power of resistance to the fact that without its help, as an irrational component, certain specific modes of existence, such as the small peasantry, would hardly be able to survive, being themselves impossible to rationalize without the collapse of the entire middle-class edifice. So, if you have small-scale agriculture in a peasant society, that is basically not sustainable in a capitalist sense, because they simply don't make enough profit. But if they are operated in the form of a family business, and that's also true of many other family businesses like small shops that are based on the exploitation of family members who don't get paid. The family members just do their time in the corner shop, for example, but they're not paid a wage, which wouldn't be possible because this corner shop doesn't make that much profit. So you cannot actually employ people in a capitalist proper way. But they can survive because the survival is allowed through the deployment of family members as basically more or less free labor. I mean, not totally free, you have to feed them and so on, and you have to buy them stuff, but that's probably much cheaper than paying a wage. So that's, and so he uses these examples of sort of contradictory forms that are kind of like Russian dolls a little bit, sort of mixed up with each other, to illustrate the interrelationship or the strange mixture between rationality and irrationality in our society. By irrationality, so just to make that clear, when I say that love is irrational, that is obviously not meant to be a negative thing, quite the opposite. So the also if you take a critical perspective, then to be irrational is a very rational thing in the end of the day. If the rationality that you have in mind is the well-being of human beings. So if our well-being is the rationality that we are after, then to be irrational, if by that we mean not to think in a means-end sort of way, is very, very rational. It's absolutely important. So we need to have relationships that are not means-end rational. Otherwise we're going to go crazy. So we can basically not exist without these irrational enclaves within the very rationally organized irrationality of capitalist society. That's the idea here. Very confusing, and Obviously, you will need to read this probably 5 to 10 times until you actually have a chance of understanding what he means. So this is very dense, strange stuff. But it is okay to understand just some of this. You don't need to understand everything. That's totally impossible anyway. It's not the kind of thing that is easily understood on first reading. So it continues with the concept of rationalization, meaning that social relations become increasingly organized in terms of means and rationality in the market system and exchange of equivalence. I do this much of that and I receive that much of this kind of relationship. Now he says that these social phenomena and institutions make up society based on the antagonisms. So these antagonisms are actually what holds society together. And then here he refers explicitly to class struggle. So the class struggle, which is of course an antagonism, it is a struggle, something sometimes hostile and violent, that is actually what keeps society together. Because the class struggle is an expression of the fact that the different groups of people depend on each other. So capitalists depend on workers, because if there are no workers to exploit, then there is no capital. Likewise, workers depend on capitalists, because in a capitalist society you can't work unless a capitalist provides capital, because you need capital to work. You cannot work without instruments and without raw materials, which is capital. So this antagonism is based on mutual dependency, and that's what that's basically what glues society together. So we have a society that is very glued together. You can never have a capitalist society with only workers. That is logically impossible, because if you have workers, that presupposes that there is capitalists and capital, and the other way around. So in this context, he says, again, he reflects on contemporary sociology, the idea very common in the 60s, class is disappearing and there's no class anymore, we are now all middle class, etc., etc. And he says it might be possible that subjective class consciousness has weakened in the advanced countries, like the Western countries, but that doesn't mean that the objective reality of class has disappeared. So the fact that we might perhaps not think of ourselves as being workers or other members of other classes, that doesn't mean that we aren't. That is the point here, and he says he's basically just making some observations here in this paragraph that also in the 60s in Germany, that's obviously what he's writing about. The lower classes have fewer illusions, so their class consciousness basically consists in being less idealistic. So they have fewer idealistic ideas about society. So in that sense, they are more sort of down to earth. And he says that the happy few, like the upper middle classes, educated people, they hold their noses and they think that that workers are terribly materialist because they don't have these idealistic illusions that middle class people tend to have. So next paragraph is basically saying, far from class not being important anymore, it is actually increasingly important because the concentration of capital is advancing so dramatically. And that means that the separation of social power from social helplessness, so the separation of those who have power in society and those who are basically helpless, who can't do terribly much in society, that separation has increased hugely. That's the argument here. paragraph 12, sort of repeats itself here. So many of these paragraphs are basically restatements of the same thing from slightly different angles. So in that sense, there's quite a bit of repetition in there, but that's good because the repetition gives you a chance. You have a second chance to understand what he's trying to say. Society is increasingly penetrated by the market relationship, etc. And he says here, this is not the fault of technology or industry as such, because technology as such is only what he calls here the image of human productivity itself. So if you think about it, technology is basically knowledge. Technology is experience that has accumulated over many centuries. So we have done lots of research over a long period of time, and technology is simply the result of that accumulated knowledge. So now how the technology is actually deployed in society, that is a question of social structures, not the technology as such. That's what he's saying here. So he's basically defending technological progress and saying that the fault lies with society, not with technology as such. And anyway, technology is only an aspect or a particular area within society, not something that is somehow developing on its own, as it were. So the next thing, a rational and genuinely free society, so the kind of society that we would love to live in, could do without administration as little as it could do without the division of labor itself. So, similar argument here, administration as such has to exist, and the division of labor has to exist in any kind of society, because everybody cannot do everything, especially when things are kind of more highly developed, as with modern work processes. So everybody cannot do everything, obviously. So there has to be division of labor, and that has to be administered, because you have to mediate between these different groups of people. But all over the globe, all over human society, administrations have tended under constraint towards a greater self-sufficiency and independence from their administered subjects. So that goes back to the statement in the beginning, for example in the 5th paragraph, where he says that this society and its institutions has increasingly become independent from us and basically you could say alienated from us who are actually the producers of that society and its institutions. So that is the continues here in this paragraph, so restatement basically. Now paragraph 14 continues again with the concept of institutions and their appearance of self-sufficiency and independence. And that would seem to be socially necessary, kind of something ideological. If you reflect on it, yet such pure appearance is the ens realissimum in the immediate life of man. Ens realissimum is a philosophical term, Latin obviously, that actually refers to God in medieval philosophy. So ens means being, realissimum means the most real being. So obviously in medieval theology you can guess the most real being is actually God. However, God is it is kind of a bit paradoxical, and I think it is intended to be such, because God is obviously not graspable, so it is not an actual presence. So God is sort of an absent being, but if you are a believer, it is the most real. And he's making this comparison here that the supposed autonomy of the institutions, their independence from us, is for our everyday life, for the experience, for our experience of our everyday life, totally real. In the same sense that for a religious person, God is totally real. Although on reflection, neither God nor this independence of the institutions actually exists. So it is sort of an illusion, but it is a real illusion. It is an illusion that actually has real consequences. And then he makes again here a short historical observation. He says that in the middle of the 19th century, a class struggle was a conflict between a group immanent to society, the middle class, and one which was half outside, the proletariat. And then he refers here sort of positively to Spencer, namely the notion of integration and differentiation. That is Spencer's signature. So you know Herbert Spencer was a British sociologist, sort of more or less related to Comte's positivist philosophy. And his signature statement in theory was that modern society is characterized by both integration and differentiation. Differentiation basically refers to the division of labor, and integration is the integration through the division of labor. So it is the division of labor, the differentiation, that actually integrates society. And Adorno refers to that here and says that this is exactly what happened in the period since the 19th century, where you still had basically in the proletariat a class that is almost not part of society, but increasingly has become integrated. To the extent that in present society we are just totally integrated. And this is continued in the next paragraph. Integration goes even further than this. And now he talks about the psychic structure of the individuals, which is adapted to the social environment. Basically, like in biology, animals are understood to be adapting to their environment. And that's what we do, except that this environment is society. So we adapt our internal psychic structure to the external reality of the society that we have created. So you see, the argument basically comes back to the argument in the beginning of the text. And so I'm not reading out all this, so you can do that in your own time. So this is basically just fleshing out this idea. One of the formulations is that we, through this integration, we become cogs to our own machines. So we become basically products of the machines. By machines he means the institutions of society that we have created. And says, so we come full circle, and indeed we do. Also the text itself comes full circle. So he says, men human beings, must act in order to change the present petrified conditions of existence. Petrified means they have become stone. Petros means stone. The conditions of existence that have become like rock. But the latter, these conditions, have left their mark so deeply on people, have deprived them, or rather us, of so much of their life and individuation, that they scarcely seem capable of the spontaneity necessary to do so. From this, apologists for the existing order draw new power for their argument that humanity is not yet ripe, not yet ripe for a freer and more emancipated form of society. So that is the paradox, and this is one of the most important points in critical theory, that the more this integration in this totality of society proceeds, and the more powerful the institutions become, the more difficult it becomes for us to break them open. But this breaking open must happen somehow, but we don't know how. And then he says that society always response to any form of criticism, well, propose some improvements then. And he says basically that if you're a critic of society, then you should refuse making these so-called positive proposals. You should refuse to propose positive steps, because that is simply a way in which society integrates even the critique. So also the criticism and the resistance of those who suffer from the overwhelming power of these institutions, they are integrated into these institutions by being forced to make positive proposals. And he says critique should simply be negative, so you should not make positive proposals, but rather formulate critique in such a way that the utterance of the critique reminds everybody of the possibility that our capability to be critical is threatened with suffocation. So that is the most important thing, that we act in such a way that the memory is maintained that society is actually threatening to suffocate the very ability to critique that society. And that's how it ends. Okay, thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments on this rather dense and somewhat strange piece of writing. Thank you.